She traveled 1,000 miles for a wedding. Instead, she got a public execution. The wind in Crestwood, Wyoming didn't smell like promises. It smelled like dust and horseshoe iron and endings. When Agnes stepped down from the stagecoach, she did it with her chin held high, a shield against the eyes she knew were watching. A blue ribbon was tied around her waist, the exact same one she'd sent in the photograph months ago, a small hopeful flag in a sea of brown and gray. Her boots hit the dry, cracked soil as if they owned it, as if they expected to be welcomed. She stood there for a moment, brushing dust from her skirt that wasn't really there. Her gaze was ice, scanning the faces in the small, harsh town, ranchers lounging by the saloon doors, their eyes lingering a moment too long. Women in sunbonnets hanging laundry, their movements suddenly still. The sheriff, a thick man with a drooping mustache, squinting beneath the brim of his hat. But no one stepped forward. No one moved at all. In her hands, she clutched a letter, the paper so creased and folded it felt like cloth. It was stained by nervous sweat and the long journey west. The name on it was Thomas Halpern, a name that had sounded like a prayer in her lonely room back in Tennessee. He was the man who had written with such bold, flowing script, the man who had promised her a cabin near the Red Cliffs, a wedding in the spring, a horse of her very own. The man who signed every letter, yours soon, God willing. And then she saw him. He was standing across the town square, leaning against a post, talking to another man. He was just as the photograph had shown him, tall, fair-haired, handsome in a way that seemed careless. He glanced her way once, just once. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition, no smile, nothing. He turned his face away, quick, as if the sun had suddenly blinded him. Then he pushed himself off the post, lowered his hat, and walked off down the street, never breaking his stride, never looking back. He just left her there. The shame didn't come like thunder. It came like fire eating through a cotton dress, a slow, silent heat that consumes everything before you even realize you're burning. It was a public shunning, a verdict delivered without a trial. The whole town was the jury, and they had all seen it. She took a breath, trying to steady the world that was tilting beneath her feet. There had to be a mistake, a reason. She walked toward the boarding house, her steps feeling heavy and loud on the wooden boardwalk. The sign, painted in neat letters, said, "Rooms for let." The woman who answered the door was named Mrs. Dorcas Albee. She peered over her spectacles, her face pinched, her eyes inspecting Agnes like she was a piece of meat that had gone sour. "You're the one," Mrs. Albee said. It wasn't a question. The one who wrote about a wedding. She glanced past Agnes toward the empty spot where Thomas Halpern should have been. "Well, it don't look like there's a wedding." Agnes held out her small cloth purse, the coins inside representing everything she had left in the world. "I can pay. For a room. Just for a little while." Mrs. Albee didn't even look at the money. She shook her head, her lips a thin, merciless line. "You can't stay here. This is a respectable house. Folks are particular, and they're already whispering more than I like." The door closed in her face with a soft, final click. The town didn't just ignore her now, it watched her. It was a cruel kind of entertainment. Young women in aprons giggled behind shop windows. A group of boys, no older than 10, started tossing small stones that landed near her boots, a game of casual contempt. The sheriff, the man with the drooping mustache, tipped his hat as he walked past, a gesture that held no warmth, only dismissal. He said nothing. The preacher, a gaunt man named Harlan Cobb, stopped her on the street. He offered to pray with her, his eyes full of a pity that felt worse than scorn. But when she asked if the church had a room, a place she could stay, he said he couldn't offer one. It wouldn't be proper. So Agnes walked. She walked past the saloon, past the general store, past the last fence post that marked the edge of Crestwood's meager civilization. She walked until the whispers of the town were replaced by the whisper of the wind in the pines. She found a grove where the trees leaned over a forgotten barn. It was a skeleton of a building, half collapsed, one of its main beams bowed like a man in deep mourning. But it had a roof, mostly, and it had hay, and most importantly, it had silence. She climbed the rickety ladder into the loft, the wood groaning under her weight. She found the deepest, warmest pile of straw she could and curled herself into a tight ball, wrapping her arms around her knees. And only then, in the dusty dark where no one could see, with the smell of decay and forgotten seasons all around her, did she finally let the tears come. That night, she dreamed of music. It wasn't a song she could name, but the shape of one, a melody that felt like the warm, humid air of Tennessee summers. She dreamed of her mother's voice humming by the garden, a sound that meant safety, a sound that meant she was chosen, that she was loved. She woke up to the bitter cold. The second night was worse. Her fingers grew stiff. The wind found every gap in the barn's old wood and rattled through them with a mournful howl. The ground outside turned white with the first hard kiss of frost. Her stomach, empty for nearly 2 days save for half a biscuit, growled with a hollow, burning ache. The letter from Thomas Halpern, the one full of lies, remained folded in her pocket. She couldn't bring herself to read it again, and she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It was a poison she had to carry. On the third morning, she woke to a sound that wasn't the wind. It was the sound of hooves. She scrambled to the edge of the loft and peered through a wide crack in the boards. A horse stood just outside the barn, its breath puffing in the frigid air, and on its back sat a man. He was dressed in buckskin, his hair in a long dark braid that fell over his shoulder. A fur-lined hood shadowed his face, but she could see his eyes, dark and unreadable. He wasn't a townsman. He was Apache, she guessed, his features sharp and weathered like the land itself. He didn't speak. He didn't approach. He just sat there on his horse, perfectly still, as if listening for something only he could hear. Agnes didn't move. She barely breathed. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her skin. The town had cast her out. What would this stranger do? Then, as silently as he appeared, he turned his horse and rode off, disappearing into the dark wall of trees. There was no menace in his presence, no cruelty, just a profound stillness, an observation. The sun rose higher, bringing no warmth. Her stomach burned with a desperate fire. Her hands trembled as she reached for the last few crumbs of her biscuit, rationing them, making them last. She ate them one by one, the dry, tasteless morsels doing nothing to quiet the ache. She sank back into the hay, a wave of despair washing over her. This was it. This was how it ended. Forgotten in a ruined barn, starving, freezing to death. And then the barn door creaked open. She startled, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was back, but this time, he was on foot. His horse was tied loosely to a low-hanging branch. He stood in the doorway, a tall silhouette against the pale morning light. He looked to be around 30, his skin the color of worn leather, and there was a quietness about him that unsettled her more than any shout ever could. In his hand, he held a folded cloth. He stepped just inside the barn, his eyes scanning the space before they settled on her, hiding in the loft. He didn't say a word. He walked over to a sturdy, upright beam and set the bundle down. It was bread, a tin cup, and a flask of what she knew must be water. He backed away toward the door. She still hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. She was a cornered animal, waiting for the trap to spring. Only after a long, heavy pause did he finally speak. His voice was low, almost a murmur, and held a strange, unexpected tenderness. "You can come on out now," he said. "Ain't nobody watching." Agnes stayed where she was, frozen. The straw clung to her dress, to her hair, to the last tattered remnants of her pride. He hadn't asked her any questions. He hadn't looked at her with pity or scorn like the townspeople. He just offered. He stepped back outside the barn and waited. She heard the soft stamp of his horse's hooves, the shift of its weight. The wind carried the scent of pine smoke and something else, something faintly floral, lavender maybe, from whatever the cloth had been used for. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher. Finally, her hunger won the war against her fear. She crept down the ladder, her bare feet silent on the dusty floor. She snatched the bundle and scurried back to her nest in the loft, holding it like it might vanish if she blinked. The bread was coarse and plain, baked with cornmeal. But to her, it tasted like salvation. It tasted like home. She ate it slowly, each bite a small act of defiance against the gnawing ache in her belly. For the first time in days, she didn't cry. That evening she found a wool blanket folded neatly near the barn's side door. Beside it, a pair of worn leather gloves. There was no note, no name. She didn't see him again that night, but as she looked up at the cold, glittering stars through the hole in the barn roof, she had the distinct feeling that he was out there somewhere, watching the same sky. On the fourth day, she found the courage to bathe in the creek. She hid behind a cluster of rocks slick with frost, the icy water making her gasp. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink and raw, trying to wash away the grime, the shame, the memory of Thomas Halpern's face turning away from her. She wrapped herself in the wool blanket and returned to the barn, shivering, but feeling, for the first time, a little bit human again. He was there. He was sitting on a fallen log not far from the barn, sharpening a long blade with a whetstone. The sound was rhythmic, patient. He looked up and nodded once as she approached, a simple acknowledgement of her presence. He didn't intrude. She sat on the barn's threshold, keeping a safe distance between them. She held out the gloves. "You left these," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. He glanced at them, then back at his blade. His voice was quiet, a low rumble. "They ain't mine anymore." He told her his name was John. He told her nothing else. She told him hers was Agnes, though she had a feeling he already knew. She asked where he was from. He answered with a slight shrug, his eyes on the horizon. "I've been here longer than the town's fences." That night, she didn't climb the ladder to the loft. She laid the blanket on the lower level of the barn, closer to the door, closer to the warmth of the small fire he had lit in an old metal drum just outside. And when she closed her eyes, she felt something completely unexpected. It wasn't safety, not exactly, but it was a truce. A truce with the cold, a truce with the hunger, a truce with the crushing loneliness. By the end of the week, the whispers in town had swelled into a low, angry roar. She heard them from the preacher's son, a nervous boy who brought a loaf of bread one morning, an act of charity his father likely forced on him. "They say you're living like a stray out here," the boy muttered, his eyes fixed on his boots. He glanced nervously toward the woods. They say he's keeping you, like a secret." She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tell him that the town's hypocrisy was a sickness, that their version of God lived only in their judgment, not in their hearts. But the shame was a physical thing, a hand that choked her before the anger could find a voice. Still, after the boy scurried away, she stayed. She stayed even as the old barn moaned under the first real weight of winter. She stayed as the wind bit through the cracks in the boards like hunger through flesh. She stayed because sometimes the only kindness left in a place is the kind that doesn't speak, the kind that offers a blanket and a piece of bread and waits. The town had left her for dead, but someone else, a stranger from the woods, had looked at her hiding in the darkness and said, "Come on out." And somehow that one quiet voice lingered louder than all the others. The frost deepened, crawling up the barn's old beams like pale, skeletal ivy. Agnes awoke with a sharp intake of breath, her joints aching from the penetrating cold, a punishment for a night spent curled too tightly on the hard-packed earth. Her dress still held the faint, musty scent of old hay, but there was a deep, reassuring warmth in the wool blanket draped around her shoulders. It was the one John had left, the one he kept bringing back, a silent, recurring promise. She hadn't spoken to a soul in Crestwood in days, not since the sheriff had averted his gaze as if looking at her might stain him, not since the preacher had offered her hollow prayers instead of shelter. The town had drawn a circle around her, and she was on the outside. But the Apache widower, she'd pieced that much together from the town's cruel whispers. He kept returning. He never came with questions. He never came with judgment. He just came. Each visit brought something quiet and essential. A loaf of dark, heavy bread wrapped in linen, a small bucket of goat's milk still warm, a tin of dried meat, salty and tough, that filled her belly and gave her strength, and he brought a silence so full and deep it seemed to soften the hard edges of being forgotten. He never stood too close. He never crossed the invisible boundary she had drawn around herself, a line made of caution and fear. He would simply appear, a shadow detaching from the trees, leaning against his horse. Sometimes he would whittle a piece of wood, his hands moving with an unhurried, mesmerizing grace. Sometimes he would just stare at the sky, as if reading a story written in the clouds. Agnes watched him through the slats in the barn wall, a strange conflict warring inside her. How could one person feel like a complete stranger and a safe harbor, all at the same time? One morning, as the first lazy snowflakes of the season began to drift across the fields, she did something bold. She stepped outside, holding the empty tin he had left the day before. "I can wash this," she said. Her voice was a rasp, a rusty thing from days of disuse. John looked up from his whittling, surprised, but only slightly. A flicker of something in his dark eyes. "Ain't no need." She stood her ground, clutching the tin. It was a small thing, a pathetic offering, but it was all she had. "I want to." He considered her for a long moment. Then he nodded, and the briefest, faintest trace of a smile touched the corner of his mouth before vanishing. She knelt by the stream, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. Her hands were numb as she scrubbed the tin clean with sand and icy water. Her own reflection rippled and broke on the surface, a distorted, wavering ghost. Behind her, the pine forest whispered secrets to the wind. She could feel his gaze on her from the distance. It wasn't intrusive, it was just steady. When she walked back and handed him the clean tin, he said only, "Thank you." Not a question, not an invitation to talk, just 2 words, and for now, that was enough. Over the next few days, the wall of silence between them began to develop small cracks. They started to share things, not in conversations, but in slivers. She spoke of Tennessee and fragmented memories, the way the roses on the porch back home had curled around the posts like reaching fingers, the sound of her mother singing old hymns while she sewed, the weary, defeated look in her father's eyes, a look she hadn't understood until now. John listened. He listened with a focus that was unnerving, that made her feel more seen than she had ever felt in her life. He never commented, never offered advice, never filled the silences with meaningless chatter. Instead, he worked. He split wood with powerful, efficient swings of his axe. He mended a broken saddle, his fingers surprisingly nimble. He tied bundles of dried herbs with strips of sinew. His hands were calloused and scarred, but they were careful, gentle hands. His presence was never rushed. One afternoon, he left something new by the barn door. It was a small book, bound in worn leather. The corners were soft with age. She opened it. Pressed into the inside cover, in elegant fading ink, was a name. Anita. Agnes traced the letters with her thumb, a strange chill running down her spine. The next day, when he returned with a brace of rabbits, she held the book out to him. "Your wife?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded once, his face unreadable. "She passed," he said, his voice flat. "In the winter. Childbirth." She didn't press further. She understood that some losses are too heavy to be unwrapped for a stranger. That evening, a fragile truce was established. She sat on the barn's threshold, and he sat on a stump nearby, a respectful distance between them. The snow fell softly, silently, as if it didn't want to interrupt the quiet moment. "I was supposed to marry a man named Halpern," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "He saw me, right there in the town square, and he just left. Didn't even say my name." John didn't respond right away. He stared into the falling snow, his jaw tight. Then, without turning to look at her, he said, "Names only mean what people make of them. Maybe yours ain't finished yet." The next morning she found her boots placed neatly by the barn door. The caked mud had been cleaned off, the leather treated with some kind of oil, the laces tightened, and sitting beside them was a small, intricate carving, an elk, no larger than her thumb, carved from a piece of pale wood. She stared at it for a long, long time, turning it over and over in her palm. And she wondered why this small, silent kindness somehow hurt more than all the town's loud, vicious cruelty had. Because the town had not forgotten her. If anything, its memory was getting louder. Two lanky boys from the saloon, reeking of cheap whiskey, swaggered out to the edge of town. They tossed a stone that clattered against the side of the barn, and one of them shouted a name, a vile, ugly word that cracked through the winter air like a whip. She didn't flinch. She just pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and continued sweeping the dirt floor of the barn with a branch, an act of defiant domesticity. Later that day, Pastor Cobb stopped by the barn on his way to visit a sick parishioner. His eyes were kind, but they were nervous, shifty. "I only mean to say," he murmured, shifting his weight from one boot to the other, "that appearances, they matter, especially for a woman on her own." She didn't answer. She just looked past him, to the spot in the trees where John's horse had stood earlier that morning. "I'm not on my own," she said finally. Her voice held no defiance. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with a kind of tired grace. The pastor stammered something about God's judgment and hurried away. That evening, John brought wild honey in a small clay jar, a rare treat, a luxury. Agnes lit a candle inside the barn, the single flame dancing on the rough timber walls, and she poured the golden, sticky honey over a piece of old cornbread he'd left earlier. They ate on opposite sides of the open doorway, with only the silent falling snow between them. After they finished, she did something else that surprised both of them. She picked up Anita's book. "Would you like me to read from it?" she asked. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the flickering candlelight. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Her voice trembled at first, stumbling over the words, but then it steadied. The story in the journal was simple. It was about a woman planting seeds, losing the first shoots to a late frost, and then planting again. It was about hope, tucked into the cold, hard soil, again and again and again. When she finished the passage and looked up, John's eyes were closed. He wasn't asleep. He was listening. Something inside her shifted that night. It wasn't a sudden, loud crack. It was a quiet, subtle change in weight, like a heavy coat finally being hung up after days of wear. The next morning, she caught sight of her reflection in the old, cracked mirror that was nailed crookedly above a water trough. For the first time, she really looked. Her face had softened. The sharp, worried line that had been etched between her brows had eased. She found the brush she'd packed in her trunk, it felt like a lifetime ago, and combed her hair for the first time in a week. That same afternoon, she walked into town. She didn't plan to. Her feet just started down the path, past the leaning fence posts, toward the street where she had been so brutally cast out. The people stared. Of course they stared. The murmurs began before she even reached the steps of the general store, a low, buzzing sound like angry wasps. Mrs. Albee, the boarding house owner, saw her from her porch and sniffed loudly, a theatrical display of disgust. Agnes kept walking. Inside the store, she bought two things, salt and a box of matches. She placed the coins on the counter, her hand steady, and said, "Thank you," her voice clear and even. As she turned to leave, a woman sitting near the pot-bellied stove muttered, just loud enough for her to hear, You'd think shame had a limit. Agnes paused at the door. The whole store went silent, waiting. The old Agnes would have shrunk, would have fled, but that Agnes was gone, left behind in the dust and the tears. She didn't answer the woman. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own reply. Outside, leaning against the hitching post, was John. He hadn't gone in. He never did. He was an outsider by birth. She was an outsider by decree. When she stepped beside him, he handed her a bundle of dried sage, tied with a leather cord. "For the cold," he said. She took it, and for the first time, she smiled at him. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't the kind that comes from happiness. It was the kind that comes from surviving another day with grace. They walked back to the barn together, side by side, through the falling snow. They didn't speak. By the time they reached the tree line, Agnes was humming. A tune she hadn't remembered in years, a half-forgotten melody from her mother's garden. The melody danced in the still, cold air, just above the sound of the wind in the pines. And in the quiet that followed, John looked at her. He didn't look at her like she was a guest in his charity. He didn't look at her like she was a burden he had to bear. He looked at her like she was someone who had stayed, someone who hadn't run, and who, perhaps, wasn't planning to. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the book, Anita's book. As she sat by the fire that night, she decided to read more. She opened it to a random page, and that's when she saw it. The handwriting. It was elegant, precise. The T's were crossed with a flourish. The A's were perfectly rounded. A chill, colder than the winter wind, crawled up her spine. She scrambled for her travel bag, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. She pulled out the letter, the one signed, "Yours soon, God willing, Thomas Halpern." She held the journal and the letter side by side in the flickering firelight. Her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was identical. The letters weren't from Thomas Halpern. They couldn't have been. This graceful, careful script belonged to a woman. The letters that had brought her 1,000 miles. The promises of a wedding and a cabin and a life. They had been written by John's dead wife. A ghost had summoned her to Crestwood. A dead woman had chosen her. And the question that screamed in the sudden, roaring silence of the barn was not just why. It was, did John know? Was this all some elaborate, cruel deception? Was his kindness just a mask for a secret so dark it could shatter what little was left of her? The world, which had just started to feel solid beneath her feet, dissolved into smoke once more. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She sat there in the cold, dusty barn, the journal in one hand and the letter in the other, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The two sets of handwriting swam before her eyes, a perfect, impossible match. A dead woman had written to her. A dead woman had made promises she could never keep. Was John's kindness a lie? Was he part of this charade? Was he pitying her? Or was he mocking her? The questions circled in her mind like vultures. For a moment, all the old fear and shame came rushing back. She was a fool, a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. She spent the night sleepless, the wool blanket wrapped around her, providing no warmth against the chill that came from within. By morning, her fear had cooled into a hard, sharp resolve. She would not run. She would not hide. She had faced down a town full of hate. She could face one man with a secret. When he arrived at dawn, a silhouette against the pale, snowy landscape, she was waiting for him. She stood at the entrance of the barn, holding the open journal and the letter. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes immediately falling to the papers in her hand. The usual stillness about him was gone, replaced by a tension so thick she could feel it in the air. He knew. This was her, Agnes said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, heavy with grief and confusion. Anita, she's the one who wrote to me, not Thomas Halpern. John's gaze dropped to the ground. He took a long, slow breath, the cold air making it visible. When he looked up again, his eyes were filled with a sorrow so profound it stole the anger right out of her. Yes, he said, his voice a low whisper. It was her. And then, the story came tumbling out. Not all at once, but in broken pieces, like he was uncovering a memory that was still bleeding. Anita had been lonely. She was from the East, like Agnes, a woman of letters and quiet passions, trapped in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of Wyoming. She had started a correspondence with Agnes through a church circular, never revealing her own identity, posing as a prospective suitor. She wasn't trying to deceive. She was trying to connect. She saw in Agnes's letters a kindred spirit, another woman who dreamed of more than her small world allowed. Anita's plan, John explained, was to bring Agnes to Crestwood. Not as a bride for some man, but as a friend, a sister, someone to share the crushing loneliness of this place. She was going to reveal the truth once Agnes arrived, hoping that a bond had already been formed through their letters. But she never got the chance. She died giving birth to their son, who also didn't survive the night. John had found the bundle of letters, Agnes's letters to Thomas and Anita's unsent final draft, tucked away in a small wooden box, a week after he had buried them both. I didn't know what to do, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. It was her last wish, her last dream, to bring you here. So I watched, I waited. I thought maybe Halpern was a decent man. I thought maybe he would see you, and his voice trailed off. But I never expected that. He looked at her, his face a mask of regret. I never expected him to shame you in front of the whole town. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture that was both tragic and terrifyingly clear. His silent offerings of food and blankets weren't pity, they were penance. He was trying to honor his dead wife's last wish, trying to protect the woman his wife had chosen, even though he didn't know how. Agnes felt the ground shift beneath her feet again, but this time it was settling into place. It wasn't a lie. It was a tragedy. But the town, she whispered. Mrs. Albee, the preacher, they were so cruel, so fast. John's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. And this is when he delivered the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, the one that explained everything. Thomas Halpern, he said, his voice low and cold. He's the sheriff's son. Boom! There it was. The town's unified cruelty wasn't just casual frontier meanness. It was a conspiracy. It was an organized campaign of shame. The sheriff, his wife, the preacher, Mrs. Albee, they were all in on it. They knew Thomas wasn't the one who wrote the letters. They must have suspected something was amiss. And when Agnes showed up, a living, breathing piece of evidence of some strange secret, they did the only thing they could think of to protect their own. They decided to destroy her, to drive her out of town with shame before she could ask questions, before the truth of Anita's secret correspondence could come to light and tarnish the Halpern family name. They hadn't just rejected her, they had tried to erase her. A storm was brewing, not just in Agnes's heart, but in the sky. The clouds gathered, dark and heavy, and the wind began to howl with a new ferocity. The temperature plummeted. This wasn't just snow, this was a blizzard. You can't stay here, John said, his voice urgent. The barn won't stand up to this. He looked at her, his offer hanging in the air between them, fraught with all the new, complicated truths they now shared. Come to the cabin. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a command. It was an offering of shelter, the only real shelter she had been offered since she arrived. She looked from his earnest, grief-stricken face to the collapsing barn, and then toward the town that had tried to bury her. They had all underestimated her. She nodded. The journey to his cabin was a battle against the elements. The wind tore at them, and the snow fell so thick and fast it was like walking through a white curtain. He led the way, his body a shield against the worst of the wind. The cabin was small, built by hand, solid against the storm. It smelled of cedar, smoke, and dried herbs. A simple bed stood in one corner, a stone hearth in the center. It was a place of quiet solitude, a place built for 2 people who were now gone. The blizzard raged for 3 days. They were trapped together in the small, warm space, the world outside erased by a wall of white. But something else was happening. A fever was taking hold of John. The chill of the storm had seeped into his bones, and by the second night he was shivering violently, his skin burning hot to the touch. He had saved her from the storm, and now the storm was trying to take him. Agnes refused to let it. She became a fierce, tireless nurse. She fed him broth, spoon by spoonful. She bathed his brow with snow-melted water. She crushed the herbs she found hanging from the rafters, remembering things her mother had taught her, making infusions and praying they would work. When his shivering became uncontrollable, she did the only thing she could think of. She lay down beside him on the narrow bed, wrapping her own body around his, trying to give him her warmth, her life. She whispered to him, not just his name, but Anita's, telling him that his wife wouldn't want him to give up, that her last wish was for life, not for more death. And he lived. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The sun came out, glittering on a world that was pristine, white, and silent. And John's fever broke with it. He woke up weak, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her, sitting in a chair by his bed, exhausted but awake. And the look in his eyes was not one of gratitude or of duty. It was something else entirely. It was a look of awe. As he recovered his strength over the next week, the silence between them changed. It was no longer a silence of caution or grief. It was a silence of comfort, of understanding. They moved around the small cabin in a seamless, unspoken rhythm. He would chop wood, she would cook, she would mend his clothes, he would carve small animals from scraps of pine. They were 2 lonely souls, brought together by a ghost who had found a strange, unexpected solace in each other's presence. When spring finally began to touch the land, melting the snow and bringing forth the first hints of green, John said to her, "You should walk into town today." She looked at him, surprised. "Why?" "Because," he said, his voice quiet but strong, "they need to see you. They need to see that they didn't break you." So she went. She bathed in the creek, braided her hair, and put on the same ivory dress she had worn the day she arrived. But it fit differently now. It felt like her own skin. John gave her a necklace before she left, a simple silver chain with a single smooth turquoise stone. "It was hers," he said. "I think she'd want you to wear it." She didn't ride into town on a borrowed mare this time. She walked, head high, shoulders back. She walked straight into the sheriff's office. Sheriff Halpern was there, and so was his son, Thomas. They both looked up when she entered, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. Agnes didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply walked to the sheriff's desk and laid down the bundle of letters. Anita's letters. "Your son is a coward, Sheriff," she said, her voice as calm and clear as a winter morning. "But he's not a liar, because he never wrote these." She looked at Thomas, who was staring at the letters, his face pale. He couldn't meet her eyes. "A woman named Anita Red Elk wrote these," Agnes continued, her gaze locking onto the sheriff. "She was John Red Elk's wife. She was my friend. She invited me here. And when she died, you and your family decided it was easier to destroy a stranger's reputation than to risk a single whisper of scandal touching your name." The sheriff was speechless. He just stared at the elegant, damning handwriting on the papers. Agnes turned to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back at them. The 2 most powerful men in town, rendered silent by a woman they thought they had thrown away. "You tried to bury me," she said, and a small, true smile touched her lips. "You didn't know I was a seed." She walked out into the sunshine, leaving them in the ruins of their own secrets. Life began. Not the life she had been promised in a letter, but a life that she built with her own 2 hands. Agnes and John became a fixture at the edge of town. They started a small trade. He would bring his intricate wood carvings, elk, bears, eagles, and she would sell baskets of medicinal herbs she'd learned to identify, pine-scented soap she made herself, and jars of the wild honey he collected. At first, the townspeople were wary. They watched them from a distance, whispering. But the whispers were different now. The scorn was gone, replaced by a grudging respect, and then, slowly, by a quiet admiration. They saw a woman who hadn't been broken by their cruelty. They saw a woman who had faced them down and won, not with anger, but with a quiet, unshakable dignity. They saw a survivor, and they saw the way John Red Elk stood beside her. His presence was a silent, unwavering shield. He never spoke to the townspeople, but his message was clear. She is with me. She is protected. She is home. One day, Pastor Cobb approached them, the same man who had offered her prayers instead of a room. His face was full of a shame that was years too late, but it was there. He stammered an apology. He said he had been a coward. He asked if there was anything he could do. Agnes looked at John, and a silent conversation passed between them. "Yes," she said, "there is." They were married on a warm spring afternoon, not in the church, but on the edge of town, beneath a tall sycamore tree, near the two simple stone markers where Anita and her child were buried. There was no audience, just the preacher, his hands trembling as he read from his worn Bible, the breeze carrying the scent of new life, and two people who had found each other in the wreckage of a long winter. They didn't have rings. When the preacher asked for them, Agnes untied the turquoise necklace from her neck and tied it around John's wrist. In return, he pressed a small, smooth, carved bead into her palm. It wasn't a ring. It was a promise, worn smooth from the days he had carried it in his pocket, thinking of her. The preacher pronounced them man and wife. He looked at Agnes, his eyes full of a newfound respect. "What name should I write in the book?" he asked. Agnes Halpern was what was expected. She looked at the man standing beside her, his hand warm and steady in hers. She thought of the woman who had unknowingly brought them together. "Agnes Red Elk," she said. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the town fading behind them. The road no longer felt long or hostile. It felt earned. That evening, she returned to the abandoned barn one last time. It was a hollow, empty place now, a ghost of her former life. The wind still whistled through the cracks, but it didn't sound mournful anymore. It sounded like a song. She walked to the beam where, in a moment of despair, she had scratched her name with a sharp stone. Agnes. She touched the letters once, a farewell to the woman she used to be. Then she took out the small knife John used for carving and, just beneath it, she carefully carved her new name. Agnes Red Elk. As the sun lowered behind the hills, painting the sky in streaks of fire and gold, she sat in the doorway and listened to the wind. This time, it wasn't empty. It carried a story. Her story. And the final line wasn't about the man who didn't want her. It was about the man who saw her, truly saw her, and stayed. If you've ever been turned away, made to feel like you don't belong, or treated like a secret to be hidden, remember Agnes Red Elk. Her name was once a mark of shame, whispered with pity and scorn. But she refused to let others write her story. She picked up the pen and wrote it herself. Sometimes the snow doesn't come to bury you. Sometimes it comes to wash the whole world clean, so you can rise. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You never know what secrets are waiting to be uncovered.